and first start with the discussion that we had prior to the interview, and you raised a point that I hadn't heard before, and it was really interesting. You said one of the issues that South Africa is facing right now is the issue of how many people are coming into the country and actually taking these social grants. Tell us a little bit about that.
In fact, this problem expresses itself in two ways. That people who cross over from the neighboring SADC countries like Swaziland, Lesotho, some from Mozambique and Zimbabwe, as was reported by the Department of Social Development a few weeks ago, coming over, some of them managing to persuade and even bribe local traditional leaders to sign an affidavit for their children or for themselves so that they get South African IDs. So during the payday, it is reported that people do cross over the border to receive the money, and then they retreat back to their home countries. And the second part of this particular problem is the fact that South Africa has not been very effective in managing its borders and the inflow of population coming from outside. To that extent, it is not yet known with degree of certainty as to how many people are in the country illegally. And those two are beneficiaries of the social grant system, because upon arrival, some of them again manage to find the identity documents or even bribe the officials to get those documents. So the problem is not only the expansion of the age that is covered by social grant, but it is also this kind of unaccounted for expenditure.
And at the end of the day, I mean, there are quite a few dangers. I mean, one of the things that we have seen in, you know, xenophobic attacks that have taken place, mostly in places where people are struggling in terms of resources. But another issue is that when you're spending so much on public services, it's not something that can be sustained. And we're seeing this happen with some of the countries in Europe. And so just going forward, if we cannot deal with this crisis right now, where do you see South Africa headed?
I do think that it actually poses a serious risk if South Africa doesn't address its productive capacity in order to win a number of people who are covered by the social grants. Because over time, the tax base and those paying taxes is shrinking, and those who are receiving social grants is increasing. And the productive sector, as well as the infrastructure, is now no longer competing effectively with the consumptive sector. So in the long run, this will create a problem and even a social disorder, because once people receive the social grants, it's almost impossible to remove them without protest, and it is politically risky as well.
Well, let's just talk about some of the austerity measures, because, I mean, one of the things you are saying right now is just if we were to withdraw that. But I would imagine, and again I bring the issue of what's happening in the Eurozone right now, that austerity measures, you don't want to put them in when you are in a situation where you need to put them in. You want to put them in when your economy is still quite healthy. So just in terms of how the government would be able to do this in a sustainable manner, you have talked about political risk and other risks, but how can the government be able to start withdrawing some of these grants that maybe need to be reviewed?
I do think that some of the steps which could be less painful would be to come with an incentive structure which would promote people starting business and leaving social grants, and monitoring them, giving them capacity and a life outside the social grant and dependency. That is the most viable system. Then over time, it would also be to strengthen and review those payments which might be made to people who are not eligible for such payments, including the illegal immigrants and those who may be coming having used some ways of getting South African IDs.
Let's talk a bit about what's happening domestically with people that might, I mean, something that it seems like you've alluded to, people that might be receiving social grants who perhaps, you know, should not be receiving them. And I mean, one of the things that analysts have said over and over is that the state that South Africa is in right now, to some extent, there does need to be social benefits for people that cannot afford certain basic necessities. But let's talk a little bit about some of the grants that you feel maybe should be falling away, or some people that should not be eligible for those grants.
To start with, you have had a number of officials who receive these grants even though they are paid and they are civil servants. So you do have that segment that has to be taken care of and be removed from the system. The second one would be to fight corruption so that the efficiency of the system itself is improved. And the last one would be to simply revisit the whole notion of who is eligible for the grant, and you might begin to contain this escalating expansion of the social grant.
Doctor, I want to ask you a little bit about, you know, with the state that we're in right now and some of the issues that you have raised, there is pressure on the taxpayer, and it seems as though the pressure on the taxpayer is going to increase if we continue this way. But what does that do for people that are paying and people whose taxes are having to go to support so many other people? And we have heard this discussion of people just not being too pleased with constantly having to fork out money to take care of people, and they feel that maybe that money could be better spent elsewhere in the economy.
It is certainly going to cause resentment because right now SARS, or the revenue collecting service, has improved significantly and it's one of the best performing departments in government. But that in itself is not corresponding with the effectiveness of service that is coming. So combine that with the fact that you may have a smaller tax base and people being taxed more. It will cause either resentment as well as people trying to beat the tax system,
which we have seen to some extent in the country. Thank you so much for joining us, Doctor.